Look at the tired old surface right in front of you. The chips, the water rings, the counter or table you quietly hope nobody looks at too closely. 6 months ago, I stood over mine holding a $4 bag of sand, certain I was about to waste an entire Saturday. Instead, I ended up with a finish that two separate contractors swore was poured stone. Here is the short version, and I will prove every word of it. I turned an ugly, peeling surface into something that looks like polished marble for less than the price of a fast food lunch, while the same look from a stone shop was quoted to me at $3,200. The trick is a mix of resin and fine sand that Italian craftsmen were using more than 400 years ago, and almost nobody alive today has heard of it. Stay with me, because the real payoff is at the end. I trace this method back to a single workshop in a small Italian town, and a man whose name shows up in records from the early 1600s, and what he wrote down changes everything about how you use it. And I promise you this. You can run the exact same trial this weekend on a surface you already own with almost nothing you don't already have. I still remember the moment I was sure it had failed. I had spread the mix across an old side table in my garage, and it looked like wet cement, gray and lumpy and hopeless. I actually said out loud, to no one, that I had ruined a perfectly good table. Then I walked away, came back the next morning, and stopped dead in the doorway. But let me back up, because you need to understand how little faith I had in any of this. I have a workshop full of things that were supposed to be miracle products, fancy sealers that peeled, stone-look paints that chipped the first time a coffee mug landed too hard. So when a reader of mine, an old furniture restorer, told me that professional stone finishes are mostly just resin and grated sand, I laughed. I told him that could not possibly be true, because if it were, why would anyone pay thousands for a countertop? He didn't argue. He just told me to try it once and call him back. Here is what most people don't realize about that beautiful stone counter they are drooling over in the showroom. A huge amount of what gets sold as premium stone surface today is what the industry calls engineered stone, and engineered stone is, at its core, crushed mineral bound together with resin, roughly 90% ground quartz, or stone dust, and about 10% resin holding it all together. You are looking at sand and glue. Expensive, beautiful sand and glue. That number stopped me cold when I first read it. Because if the $1 million look is really just crushed stone and resin, then the difference between the $3,000 counter and my $4 bag of sand is not the material. It is the knowledge. It is knowing how to mix it and lay it down. So I decided to test it properly. Not on my kitchen. I am not reckless. I grabbed a battered old end table that had been sitting in my garage for years, the veneer lifting at the corners, water stains soaked deep into the top. If this mix could save that, it could save anything. My first surprise came before I even started mixing. I had assumed I would need some exotic professional resin, the kind you can only buy from a supplier with a license. I did not. I picked up a small kit of clear casting and coating resin, the same stuff hobbyists use to make river tables and jewelry, for about $18, and that one kit ended up covering 3 separate projects. And the sand? A $4 bag of fine silica sand from the hardware store, the kind sold for sandblasting and pool filters. Clean, uniform, dirt cheap. That was my whole shopping list. Resin, sand. A cheap plastic mixing cup, and a stir stick I already had. I remember standing at the register thinking there was no chance this added up to anything worth showing anyone. But before I tell you what came out of that mix, you need to know where it came from, because the history is the part that made me take it seriously. Long before anyone poured a modern countertop, there were craftsmen who could make a humble plaster wall look like the rarest marble on earth. The technique has a name. It is called scagliola, and the man most often credited with perfecting it worked in the town of Carpi, in northern Italy, in the very early 1600s. His name comes down to us as Guido Fassi. What Fassi and the craftsmen after him did feels like magic even now. They took cheap, common material, a fine mineral powder, and bound it with glue and pigment into a paste. They spread it, shaped it, ground it down, and polished it until it looked like marble, so convincing that it fooled the wealthiest families in Europe. Churches, palaces, grand halls, all decorated with what was essentially fancy sand and binder, dressed up to look like stone that would have cost a fortune to quarry and haul. Think about that. 400 years ago, working people figured out how to fake the most expensive surface in the world using the cheapest materials around. And they did it so well that some of those surfaces are still standing, still gleaming in Italian churches today. Here is what got me. The principle has not changed one bit. Modern resin plus modern graded sand is the exact same idea Fosse was using, just with better glue. The craftsmen of Carpi didn't have epoxy, so they used animal glue and a mineral called selenite. We have something far stronger and far more waterproof, which means, in theory, my $4 version should not just match the old method, it should beat it. So why did nobody tell me this? Why did I spend years thinking stone look finishes were out of reach? Hold that thought, because the answer is coming, and it made me angry once I understood it. For now, back to my garage and that ugly little table. I mixed my first batch by eye, which was a mistake, and I will tell you the right ratio in a minute so you don't repeat it. I poured the resin, added the hardener, and then started spooning in the fine silica sand and stirring. The mix thickened into something like wet mortar, gray and unpromising. I spread it across the tabletop with a plastic putty knife, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, and I stepped back. It looked terrible. Honestly, it looked like I had smeared concrete on furniture. There was no marble, there was no shine, there was nothing that anyone would call $1 million anything. That was the moment I mentioned earlier, standing in the doorway of my garage. Sure, I had wasted my afternoon and ruined a table for nothing, but here's the thing nobody tells you about this method. The magic is not in the spreading. The magic is in what happens after it cures. When you come back with sandpaper and water and you grind the surface down, the next morning the tabletop was rock hard. And when I took a sanding block to it, wet, working in slow circles, the ugly gray skin came off, and something appeared underneath that made me stop breathing for a second. Depth. Actual depth. Like looking down into stone instead of at paint sitting on top of it. The sand grains caught the light in 1,000 tiny points, and as I kept polishing, the whole surface went from flat and dead to soft, glowing, and stone-cold smooth. I ran my hand across it, and I could not tell it from the granite sample I had picked up at the counter shop the week before. Same cool touch, same weight to the look, same subtle sparkle when the light moved. That is when I stopped laughing at my furniture restorer friend and picked up the phone. But one good table proves nothing. A skeptic like me knows that. Anybody can get lucky once on a small piece in a controlled garage. The real question, the one that would decide whether this was a parlor trick or a genuine replacement for expensive stone, was whether it could survive real life. Heat, water, a dropped pan. The daily beating a working kitchen surface takes for years. So I raised the stakes. I decided the next test would be the one that mattered. I would take a full section of old, damaged kitchen counter, the laminate lifting and burned near the stove, and I would resurface it with the same $4 mix. If it failed, I would have a mess to tear out. If it worked, I would have proof I could put my hand on every single day. Before I did that, though, I needed to solve the problem that ruined my first batch, and this is where the extension research came in and saved me. I had been guessing at my ratio, and guessing is how you get a weak, crumbly surface. So I dug into what the actual science says about mixing resin with aggregate, the technical word for sand or stone bits. University materials studies on resin-bound surfaces are surprisingly clear about this. When you load resin with the right amount of fine aggregate, you do not weaken it. You strengthen it, and you cut the cost at the same time, because sand is far cheaper than resin and far harder than resin once it cures. The sweet spot I settled on, after 3 test batches, was roughly 1 part resin to 1 part fine silica sand by volume for a spreadable stone paste, and I adjusted from there depending on how thick I wanted it. Too little sand and you get a plastic-looking puddle. Too much and it goes dry and crumbly and won't bond. 1 to 1 was my reliable starting point, and I want you to write that down because it is the single thing that separates a beautiful result from a ruined afternoon. The other thing I learned is that the sand has to be clean and dry. Any moisture, any dust, and the resin will not grip it properly. I spread my sand on a baking tray and let it sit in the sun for a few hours first. That one small step made a visible difference in how clear and hard the final surface came out. That is the whole game with any mineral finish. The little discipline nobody bothers to tell you about is the one deciding whether your work survives or peels. And it is the same discipline behind every recipe I have written down for the rest of the house, because sand and resin are only one corner of it. I wrote a set of books for the man who already paid for patch that peeled off the garage floor by spring, for sealer that let the basement stay damp, for plaster walls that keep coming back stained no matter how many times he repaints them. Inside, you learn why each of those failed, and then you mix the fix yourself from cement, lime, sugar, baking soda, silicone, or epoxy, most of it already sitting in your kitchen or your garage. These are the old Mason formulas, the bonding coats, the curing timing, the freeze and thaw calendar, with before and after cases and printable cards you can carry to the wall. To take the whole collection home, scan the QR code right there on your screen. Use the link in the description, or open the pinned comment. Now, with clean, dry sand and the right ratio in hand, I finally felt ready for the bigger job. Armed with that, I went at the kitchen counter. I cleaned the old laminate, scuffed it with coarse sandpaper so the mix would grip, and taped off the edges. Then I mixed a bigger batch, 1 to 1, resin and sand, and I spread it across that burned, ugly counter in a smooth layer. Same as before, it looked awful going on. Gray, thick, hopeless. By now, I knew better than to panic. I let it cure a full day. Then came the part I have come to love. Wet sanding. I started with a coarser grit to knock down the high spots, then worked up through finer and finer papers, keeping the surface wet the whole time so the grit could cut cleanly. With every step, the surface got smoother, deeper, and more like stone. The burned patch vanished completely. The lifting laminate was now buried under a solid, seamless mineral skin. For the final shine, I did something the old Scagliola masters would have recognized instantly. They finished their marble imitations by polishing with progressively finer abrasives and then buffing them to a glow. I did the same, finishing with a very fine grit and then a light coat of resin wiped thin as a sealer. When it cured, that counter had a wet, glassy, deep shine that honestly looked better than the granite sample I kept comparing it to. My total cost for that whole counter section came to under $20 in materials. The quote I had gotten from the stone shop for the same area was over $3,000. Let me say that again so it lands. Under $20 against $3,000. And I could not tell them apart by touch or by eye. That was the moment my doubt died for good, but it was also the moment I got angry, and now I will tell you why. Because once I knew how simple this was, I could not stop asking the obvious question. If a 400-year-old method using resin and sand can match a $3,000 counter, why has almost nobody heard of it? Here is the uncomfortable answer I kept running into. The finished look, the engineered stone in the showroom, is one of the highest margin products in the entire home business. Remember, it is roughly 90% crushed mineral and 10% resin. The raw materials in that gorgeous slab cost a fraction of what you pay. What you are really buying is the fabrication, the brand name, the showroom, and the belief that this beautiful surface is far beyond anything you could ever make yourself. That belief is the product. That belief is what costs $3,000. And it gets worse when you look at how the very same materials are sold to regular people. The exact fine silica sand I bought for $4 gets ground up, dyed, and repackaged in small tubs, labeled as premium stone coating kits, sold for 10 and 20 times the price of the plain bag on the next shelf over. I found kits selling for $80 and $90 that contained, as far as I could tell, resin and colored sand. The same two things I was buying for around 20. Nobody is breaking the law. But somebody, a lot of somebodies, has a very strong reason for you to never find out that the $1 million finish is really just clean sand and a little glue, mixed in the right ratio and polished with patience. The knowledge that used to belong to ordinary craftsmen got quietly locked up behind showroom glass and premium price tags. The men of Carpi would not have understood this at all. To them, this was simply a skill, a way for a working craftsman to give a poor church the beauty of a rich one. They wrote it down, they taught it to apprentices, and it spread across Europe as common practical knowledge. It was never meant to be a secret. We just forgot. Now, I want to speak directly to the person watching this who is thinking, that's fine for you, you have a garage and tools and a spare table to ruin, but I can't do any of that. Maybe you rent. Maybe you don't want to touch your kitchen counter. Maybe you are not ready to resurface anything permanent. This next part is for you, specifically because I tested a version that requires you to risk nothing at all. You do not need to start on your counter. You should not, in fact. Start on something small and forgettable that you already own and would not miss. An old ceramic tile from the garage, a chipped plant pot, a cheap wooden tray, a scrap of plywood, anything with a flat surface. Here is the no-risk trial, and it costs you almost nothing because you can do it with a tiny amount of leftover mix. Take a small amount of resin, mix in an equal amount of clean, dry sand, and spread a thin layer on that scrap surface. Let it cure a full day where it is dry and out of the cold. The next day, get a piece of sandpaper wet and start sanding in slow circles. Watch what happens as the dull skin comes off and the depth appears. That is the whole secret, happening in your own hands, on something you don't care about. I promise you that the first time you see that stone-like depth rise up out of a gray smear you made yourself, something changes in how you look at every expensive surface you have ever been sold. You will never walk through a showroom the same way again. And if you want to try it with truly nothing to buy this week, there is an even older, gentler version. You do not even need epoxy to feel the principle. Take ordinary wood glue, the plain yellow kind most of us already have in a drawer, thin it slightly with water, and mix in fine sand until you get a spreadable paste. Spread it thin on a scrap of wood and let it dry hard. It will not be waterproof like resin, and it will not last on a counter. But when you sand it smooth, you will see the exact same stone effect the craftsmen of Carpi saw with their animal glue 400 years ago. It is the cheapest possible proof that this is real, and it will cost you nothing but 10 minutes. That little glue and sand test is what finally connected the whole thing for me across 4 centuries, and it is what pushed me to chase down the one detail that turned this from a neat trick into something genuinely stunning. Because everything I have told you so far gets you a beautiful, solid, stone-like surface. But it was still a little plain, just one color. I wanted the veins. I wanted the marble, not just the stone. And that is where the finale comes in. The thing I found buried in the history that no modern kit will ever tell you. I went looking for how the old masters got those impossible flowing marble veins into a material that started as plain paste. And I found it described in the Scagliola tradition that traces right back to those Carpi workshops of the early 1600s. The masters did not paint the veins on top. Painting on top always looks fake, and it wears away. Instead, they worked the color into the paste itself before it set, so the veins ran all the way down through the material like they do in real stone. Here is how they did it, and here is exactly how I copied it. They would make their base paste in one color. Then they would take small amounts of the same paste tinted with darker pigment and roll them into thin ropes, like thin snakes of colored clay. They laid those colored ropes into the base while it was still soft, and then, and this is the part that stunned me. They gently twisted and dragged and folded the whole thing together, just barely, so the dark ropes smeared and stretched into natural, random veins running through the pale base. Not painted on, built in, all the way through. When they ground the surface down and polished it, those veins appeared as if they had always been part of the stone, because in a real sense they now were. Cut into it anywhere, and the pattern continued below the surface, exactly like genuine marble. That is the difference between a fake that fools no one and a fake that fooled European royalty for centuries. So I tried it. I made my base batch pale, 1 part resin to 1 part fine white sand, with a little white pigment. I made a small dark batch with a few drops of black and gray tint. I rolled the dark mix into thin ropes, laid them across my pale paste, and then I took my stir stick and, very gently, I dragged and folded. Just a few passes, terrified I would overdo it and turn the whole thing muddy gray. I let it cure. I wet sanded it the next day, working up through the grits, holding my breath. What came up out of that surface was the most convincing marble I have ever seen come off a workbench. Soft gray veins wandering through a cream background, catching the light, flowing in a way no brush could ever fake, because they were not on the surface, they were the surface, all the way down. I laid my finished piece next to a photo of a genuine Italian marble slab, and I had to look twice to remember which one I had made. That is the finale. That is the thing the 400-year-old craftsman knew, and the modern showroom will never teach you. Because the whole business depends on you believing those veins are a miracle of nature you could never reproduce. They are not. They are ropes of tinted paste, twisted by hand, by anyone patient enough to try, using a technique written down in the workshops of Carpi before your great-great-grandparents were born. I have now done this on the little end table, on the kitchen counter section, and on a bathroom vanity top. Months later, they are all still hard, still glossy, still shrugging off water and heat and daily use. The counter takes hot pans off the stove and shows nothing. The vanity gets splashed every morning and beads the water like glass. The total I have spent across all 3 projects, including that $18 resin kit that covered all of them, is less than $60. The stone shop quotes for the same 3 surfaces would have run me well past $6,000. So let me leave you with what this really was. It was never about sand and glue. It was about discovering that a beautiful thing I had been told was far beyond my reach was sitting in my hands the whole time, for $4, waiting for me to stop believing the price tag and start believing the people who figured it out 4 centuries ago. You are the kind of person who suspected all along that a lot of what we are told is out of reach is really just knowledge somebody decided to charge us for. You were right, and now you have the proof and the steps. Here is what I want you to tell me. When you try the wet sanding step, that moment when the dull gray skin comes off and the depth suddenly appears underneath, I want to know if it stopped you the way it stopped me in my garage doorway. Tell me in the comments what surface you tried it on first. I read them, and I answer. If you believe, like I do, that this kind of practical knowledge was never supposed to be locked behind a showroom window, then come along with me. This channel is a running experiment in recovering the methods that worked long before we were taught to pay for everything. Follow along, because the next thing I am testing is an old way to make that finish repair its own scratches, with nothing but a little heat and pressure. And what happened when I dragged a key across it on purpose genuinely surprised me. You will want to see how that one ends. Before you go, let me say this. What you just watched was only the overview. Inside the Timeless Ways circle, I pick up right where this video stopped. You can ask me your own question, and a real person, me, answers you myself. And you won't be alone here. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. And don't worry, you can cancel anytime. Now that your surfaces shine, let me show you how to give your walls that same fresh, brand new look without the mess and cracking of old plaster. It starts right here, so stay with me.